So let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 13. Okay, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, and with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Now, the reason for looking at this verse is found in the title, God is faithful. And we're looking at the word faith, pistis in Greek, and that one word has a very wide range of meaning. It can mean the faith, as in the teaching, the doctrine of the Christian faith. And so we have the idea of walking in the faith, standing firm in the faith, keeping the faith, okay? So there's the faith. Then we talk about by faith, personal faith, and we've explored that idea for a number of weeks. But the word can also mean faithful. And pistis can refer to the faithfulness of God, as well as the faithfulness of ministers and the faithfulness of individual Christians and congregations. So the reason for looking at this verse is to take the word and apply it to the faithfulness of God. So the verse then is 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. Give the verse a title, and that title is God is faithful. And it's not the first time that Paul says this in 1 Corinthians. You may remember that you have it in chapter 1 and verse 9. God is faithful. And Paul sets out this way of referring to God in the first chapter as an encouragement, because he has a set of difficult things to do in this letter. In chapter 10, he draws our attention to the fact that God is faithful because he wants us to think about testing and testing experiences. So before we jump into the subject of testing or tempting or trial, Paul wants us to be clear that God is faithful. So we need to take this verse and give it a title, God is faithful. And then we need to rearrange the verse a little bit and see what Paul is doing. So he tells us then, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, he tells us that God is faithful. And God wants his people to be able to bear, to endure, to persevere during trial. So let's rearrange the verse and see what we make of it, okay? I'm going to try it like this. 1 Corinthians 10, verse 13. God is faithful, and he wants you to be able to endure testing. So, God does three things. And the verse outlines the three ways in which God, in his faithfulness, helps us with testings so that we may endure them. Now, I hope that's clear. And part of the problem we have in our English translations, I guess in our Czech translations, is a translation is an interpretation of the original Greek language. It's the translator's interpretation. So what we need to do is engage with the Greek text and try and make sense of it for ourselves. So this is the sense this verse makes to me. God is faithful. He wants us to endure testing. So we can say three things. Or if you like, God shows his faithfulness in at least three ways. So we're going to look at those three ways, but let's get some work done around the words. So the first word to begin with is the word temptation. Verse 13 of 1 Corinthians 10. The word has a wide meaning in the same way as the word faith has a wide meaning. So the word temptation can mean trial. So do you remember James? Count it all joy when you fall into various trials. The word can mean an experiment. So you conduct a test and you subject certain things to a test. It can mean that. It can mean a challenge, one that you might want to give yourself, or you want to challenge others. It can mean an affliction. So there's a wide range of meaning, and in all of the meanings, there's a common theme of pressure. Now, if your memories work well, do you remember a long while ago in our church, we looked at Romans 5, and we took those verses at the beginning of chapter 5 under the title, From Stress to Hope. And the word peirasmos in Greek occurs in Romans 5, just as it does here, and it refers to pressure. So what we are thinking about tonight then are the pressures of life, the trials, the testings. And if you look back at our verse, Paul is very clear, very careful in how he discusses testings. He says, if you look now at verse 13, no temptation has overtaken you. He's being really careful to tell you that a testing or a pressure doesn't come from God. It happens. It's part of the substance, the material of life. So again, he's echoing the Apostle James, when James in chapter 1 tells us that God does not test any of us, nor can indeed God be tested himself. So Paul is very clear here, okay? You must never think that a trial or an affliction or a challenge comes from God. They overtake, they happen to us. They are part of the stuff of life, okay? That's really clear here. 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. So you and I, we are subject to, we experience, we have no control over trial. Trials occur, they happen. Now, again, I've referenced James. Anyone remember in James in chapter 1, I think it's verse 2, he says there that you count it all joy when you fall into a trial. We did this last Sunday night. Trials you fall into, they overtake you. Do you get the idea then? Okay, we must never make a link between the experience of a trial and the idea that God has caused it. When trials occur, we focus our attention on the fact that God is faithful and he wants us to be able to endure them. He wants us to be able to persevere through them. Okay, that's what this verse is laying out for us. And what he does then in his faithfulness is God does three things. And I want you to see these three things very clearly. You'll be very familiar with them, I'm sure. The first thing that God ensures is that our testings, trials, afflictions are that which is common to all men. Okay, you see it at the start of verse 13. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. That's the first thing God in his faithfulness ensures. The second thing that God ensures then is the limitation to the trial. He will not allow you to be tested beyond what you are able. So there's the idea of God working in the trial to ensure that no trial is overwhelming. That's the second thing. And then the third thing that we recognize in this verse is this very curious phrase that I've puzzled over for many years, and we've talked about it for many years. The third thing is, with the temptation, he will also make a way of escape. That's the three things. Now, again, I can't tell whether you've seen the way that I want to rearrange the verse. So let me just try again. Take the last phrase, that you may be able to bear. That phrase applies to all the testings. That's the overall aim that God has in every trial, that his people might be able to bear, to be steadfast, to persevere, to endure. Okay, that's God's great aim. And to that end, then, three things apply. The testing is common to all men, there are limits to it, and there's a way of escape. And I hope that's clear. Let's take a look at each of those then in turn. Whatever testing, trial, affliction, challenge, whatever we experience, it is common to man. Now, how much do you remember about that phrase? In our English translation, we have three words, common to man. In the Greek original, it is one word, and it is the word anthropopinos, one word, and it simply means humanity. If we were allowed these days, we could even use the word mankind. No temptation has overtaken you except such that belongs to mankind. The trials that we experience are universal in their experience. They belong to the common lot of human experience. Now, God, in his faithfulness to us, he wants us to avoid making a mistake. And the mistake we can often make when facing trials is to think of that trial solely in terms of ourselves and what it's like for me. What does it mean for me? How difficult is it for me? And so our brain falls into the trap of only thinking about our own experience. Now, you know this. You've done this yourself. Many of us have done it. Some trial, challenge, some time of difficulty comes along, and our mind shrinks down so that all we then think of is what that is like for oneself. And we examine the trial, we reflect on it, we ponder over it, but we do so only from the perspective of our own experience. And so our attention focuses exclusively on what it's like for me. Now, what Paul is telling us here is there's a danger there. And the danger is you may not endure, you may not persevere in this trial if all you do is think about what it's like for you. And when you do that, and you've started to focus exclusively on yourself and your own thoughts, feelings, experiences, that isolates you. And it isolates you from others. You lose your common connection with other human beings. Now, I'm going to be really careful here because there's a well-worn phrase that we are all fed up of hearing during this coronavirus pandemic, and it's the phrase, we're all in it together. Now, if you ever hear this phrase from politicians or on the news, don't believe it, because we are not all in it together. As we've seen from Shukin, some people have far worse times in this pandemic than we do. Those who are suffering at home from domestic abuse have it far worse than those who don't. Those who perhaps have no jobs to go to or are not being paid right now have it far worse. But it's a phrase that we've heard a lot of. We're all in it together. Now, we need to be brave and accept that the word in Greek here, anthropopinos, means we're all in it together. There is a common experience to being human. And we must recognize that if we are going to endure any time of testing. In my experience, people, and I don't think I'm any different here, we lose sight of a bigger perspective, the commonality, the shared nature of trial. And when you can allow your mind to be open to the fact that a trial is shared with others, there is something in that point of view that enables you to endure. We must always avoid the thought that a trial is far worse for me than it is for anyone else. We must avoid the exclusive focus on ourselves, because that undermines the resources that are then available to us. So familiar words, people, I'm sure they are as familiar to you as they are to me. We are just reminding ourselves that during this coronavirus pandemic, the danger we face is to think that I'm having it worse than anyone else. We are shared experience here. That's the first thing. God in his faithfulness encourages us to remember. Let's look at the second. It's in the middle of the verse. Who will not allow you to be tested beyond what you are able. Now, this word able is one of the great New Testament words. And surprise, surprise, it's another word that has a huge range of meaning. So I'm going to just say the word now. And some of you will recognize the Greek word and jump to the wrong conclusion, okay? The Greek word dunamis, okay? And the wrong conclusion that you've all now jumped to is dynamite, okay? And it's something to do with explosions. The word dunamis is the word for strength, but it means inner, or the metal that you're made of, okay? The substance, that's the idea. And what this verse is saying to us here is that God in his faithfulness puts limits to our testings, and the limits, if you like, they have a message. And that message is you can. Now, does that make any sense? Let's try again. A few weeks ago, when all this started, we began to see rainbows, didn't we, in people's windows? And when we were out walking, Tracy and I were talking about those rainbows and how they have a message, they support the NHS. It's a message of encouragement and perseverance and so on. Now, this is the idea here. There's a message attached to the way God limits the trials that we experience. And the limits come with a message from God. You can. And it's a message that means you can endure. You can persevere. You can bear it. Okay? That's what the word means, dunamis. Okay? There is a mental strength that God is encouraging us to have as a result of his message, you can. Okay? We can because he's limited them. We can because he's faithful. We can because he controls our experience of trial. We can because he knows what our strength is. So all of that results in the sense that we can. Okay? So it's not easy, I think, to get a really good take on the original language here. But the sense of the final word in the phrase, that you are able, I think can much better be translated like this. Will not allow you to be tested beyond what you can endure, what you can manage. And so therefore, by implication, the message is whatever the trial, you can endure. Okay? That's how the language works. So God is faithful then. Our experiences we hold in common. We have a connection, a human connectivity in the experience of trial, which if we can be open to, we are not isolated then, we've not become disconnected, and then as we accept the wider view, we acknowledge that God limits our experience at any one time, and those limits are surrounded by the message, you can kneel, okay? You can. That's what God is saying to us. Then you come to this third phrase, the third way in which God shows his faithfulness to us. Do you see it in the verse? But with the testing will also make the way of escape. Now, this is the first of the phrases in which we see God directly intervening. Okay? God is active here in our experience of testing. Do you notice that? So in the first one, God is just asking us to understand something. The testing is common human experience. So the first expression of God's faithfulness is to do with our thinking. The second way God shows his faithfulness is that God is limiting. So this is an activity we can't see. This is God behind the scenes, making sure that we're not overwhelmed or burdened. He's pushing back certain trials. He's preventing others from occurring at the same time. But we don't know that. That's outside of our cognition. But this third one, God is actually doing something in the testing, okay, in the experience itself. It's being translated as a way of escape. Hopeless translation. The Greek word is only used twice in our New Testament. It's used here, obviously. Let me show you the second place where it is used. And I want you to spot it in the verse itself, okay? Where is it in this verse? Hebrews 13 and verse 7. Hebrews 13 and verse 7. Okay? So in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 13, it's translated as a way of escape. Hebrews 13 verse 7. Now read the verse. Look out for the word. Remember those who rule over you, who have spoken the word of God to you, whose faith follow, considering the outcome of their conduct. Now, if you've thought of this before, or heard somebody speak on it before, you might have underlined the word. But have you spotted the word? So, a way of escape. What's the other occasion then? Use the verse again. Remember those who rule over you. It's not there. Who have spoken the word of God to you. It's not there either. Whose faith follow. No. But here it is. Considering the outcome of their conduct. The word in Hebrews 13:7 is translated as outcome. That's a much better translation. So take outcome back into 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. 1 Corinthians 10:13. I'll read the whole verse. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, and with the temptation will also make the outcome. Now, isn't that much better? Doesn't that make so much more sense? that what God does in every trial and testing is he places into that trial and testing, he places the outcome. So even though we may not be aware of it, and I'm sure we aren't, the work of God is such that he actively, and because he's faithful, places into the trial the outcome. And that outcome means two things. It means that the trial itself will have an end point, an actual out point, okay? So it means that. So back to what we were saying this morning then, it's this present distress. The word present, you remember, means a brief period, a limited period. So God will put into a trial the outcome that it'll only be for a limited period. That's worked into every trial by God. But the word also has the meaning then of purpose. That into every trial, God works into it a purpose. And that is a purpose for his people. And when you think of that, then we are right back, aren't we, to James, we are right back into Romans 5, and we're even right back into Romans 8. And for me, the place where we can go from here is Romans 8 and verse 28. So that into the trial, God works into it an outcome. And the outcome is this trial will work together for good to all those who love God and are called according to his purpose. That's what God does. Now imagine the faithfulness of God in that he should work into each trial an outcome. If you like, you can think of other outcomes. Okay, I'm not saying to you these are the only outcomes. And in fact, what would be a really useful exercise would be to pore over the pages of our New Testament and to think, what are the outcomes from trials? And once you begin to think of that, so many passages will suggest themselves to you. Let me just give you a few. I've mentioned a couple of them already. So Romans 5. You know these, don't you? This is our stress to hope passage. So Romans 5 and verse 3. Not only, but we also glory in tribulations, trials, afflictions. We glory in them, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance, character, character, hope. God works in the trial an outcome. And that outcome, according to Paul here, is perseverance, character, hope. Again, we've mentioned it tonight, James 1. Let's take a look. Okay, let's all try and find James. And you see the same idea here, don't you? We've checked in with this last Sunday. Take a deep breath. James 1, verse 2. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials. Look how important this word trial is in the New Testament. Knowing that the testing, a different Greek word, of your faith produces patience. Let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Here's the sense then, that woven, and I love that word, I think woven is the right word, woven into a trial by God is the outcome. And that outcome is an expression of his purpose for you and me. He doesn't cause the trial. The trials are the stuff of life. Remember now, trials are the things that are common to man. God doesn't cause them. He limits them, but in them is the purpose, the outcome, the reason, his sovereign will, his wise counsel, his providential work inside them. And so what Paul says is, if you can maintain these three perspectives. So we've got 3 weeks left, okay? As far as we know, maybe more, who knows, of the lockdown. There's at least 3 weeks. So in each of the 3 weeks, we can take each of these three statements and enable us to bear, to persevere for these next 3 weeks. So this week then, whatever we go through, it is that which is common to man. Okay? Let's not fall on Tuesday morning, Thursday afternoon, Friday evening. Let's not fall into that mental space where we start to think it's only me. Where we begin to feel that we're on our own, that we've been left, abandoned, overburdened, that we can't bear. Let's make that this week's challenge, okay? Next week, we can go through the week with the thought, God will limit what next week brings. Whatever we may actually experience in terms of testing, our God has faithfully been at work to make sure other things have not come our way. Things that we can't imagine, things that we don't anticipate. He's working so that we are not burdened beyond. That's next week. And then the third week, if you like, leading up now to the next announcement by our wonderful First Minister, we can take the thought that in all of this, God has woven into it his outcome. And what outcomes are God concerned with? Okay? My outcome would be that I would love the lockdown lifted to see the family. That's the outcome I want. Another outcome that I want is I want to be able to go to restaurants again and so on. That's the outcome. Okay, what outcome do we want? What outcome does God want? Okay? His outcome is certain because he has woven into the trial what it is that he wishes to achieve. And we must hold on to that sense of the purpose, the end, the way out that God has in mind. It's a unique phrase that we have here in this verse. So remember Paul, he's emphasizing the faithfulness of God. It's not the only places he does this. He'll do it in Thessalonians, as we saw this morning. He says it many, many times that God is faithful. But the call is to be able to bear in the knowledge that in his faithfulness, our God is at work.